By the time I understood what I had witnessed, it was already too late to tell anyone who could have done anything about it. That is the specific cruelty of being a servant. You are present for everything. You see the moments that matter before anyone understands they matter, and you carry them alone because nobody asks what the man standing in the corner of the room saw. And by the time someone might have thought to ask, the moment has long passed into consequence, and the consequence into history, and the history into something so large that your small witnessing of it seems almost irrelevant. Almost. My name is Harrod. I served Lord Adonir of Númenórean descent for 22 years, from the time I was 19 until the time there was nothing left of him worth serving. I am telling this now because I am the only one left who was in that room, of the only one alive who stood at the wall and watched it happen and understood, even then, what understanding I was capable of at the time, that something was ending which had no business ending, that a man who should have held was about to break, and that the breaking would cost more than anyone in that room could calculate. I want to tell you what Lord Adonir was before I tell you what he became. Not because the telling will make what came after more bearable. It will not. But because the weight of what was lost only makes sense against the measure of what was there to lose. He was not the greatest of the kings who gathered that day. He would have been the first to tell you so. He had no great conquests to his name, no legendary battles, no songs sung about his campaigns in the east or the south. What he had was a kingdom that functioned, borders that held not through force alone, but through the patient construction of agreements and arrangements that took years to build and that his people understood and trusted. A court where capable men and women were promoted on merit, and where the penalty for dishonesty was swift and consistent regardless of rank. He was, in the language of men who prefer their kings to be spectacular, boring. In the language of the people who lived under him and ate regularly, and resolved their disputes through his courts, and slept without fear of arbitrary violence from their own lords, he was the best kind of ruler there is. I knew this about him, because I had watched him work for 22 years. I had carried his correspondence, and attended his councils, and stood at the wall during 1,000 meetings, and watched the quality of his attention in rooms where decisions were being made. He listened before he spoke. He asked questions that other men in his position considered beneath them. He changed his mind when given sufficient reason, and said so plainly when he did, which men who confuse stubbornness with strength found baffling. He was not without vanity or temper, or the smaller failures of character that all men carry. But underneath those things was something that I recognized even then as rare. A genuine preference for getting things right over being seen to be right. A willingness to be the least impressive person in a room if that was what the room required. He was mocked for it sometimes, in the way that careful men are mocked by spectacular ones. Too cautious, too measured. Where is his fire, his ambition, his hunger for greatness? I heard these things said about him over the years, and I watched him hear them and not particularly care, which was perhaps the most impressive thing about him. He had made his peace with being underestimated, and had found in that peace a kind of freedom that the men mocking him had never managed to locate. I thought I knew him completely. I was wrong about that, as it turned out. I knew the man he was when he was safe. I did not yet know what he was when the room turned against him. That knowledge came on a morning in the second age of the world, in the great hall of a city I will not name, where 9 kings of men had been invited to meet a guest who arrived bearing gifts. I should say something about how Sauron appeared in those days, because the name conjures images now that have nothing to do with what stood before us then. There was no darkness, no shadow, no sense of wrongness, no feeling in the air of something ancient and malevolent barely contained beneath a surface. What stood in that hall was a figure of such overwhelming radiance that the assembled kings, to men of power and presence in their own right, seemed to diminish simply by sharing a room with him. He was called Adonir in those days, the Lord of Gifts, and standing in that hall on that morning, looking at him, the name felt not like a title, but like a simple description of what he was, a being of such evident goodness and beauty and generosity that doubting his intentions felt not like wisdom, but like a failure of perception, like mistaking gold for base metal because you had only ever seen base metal and could not quite believe that something so much better actually existed. I didn't trust him. I want to be precise about that. I was a servant, standing at the wall, with no particular wisdom or foresight or special knowledge that the kings in that room lacked. What I had was the clarity of someone who is not being offered anything. The kings were being given gifts. I was not, and the man who is not being given anything can sometimes see the giving more clearly than the man who is receiving, because he is not distracted by the warmth of being chosen. What I saw, watching Adonir move through that room and speak with those kings, was a performance of such total and detailed perfection that it made me cold. Not because any single element of it was false. Each element, taken alone, was entirely convincing. The warmth in his eyes when he spoke with each king individually, the specific attentiveness, the sense each man had of being the most important person present, the way he listened, the slight lean forward, the quality of his stillness, all of it real, or seeming real, or real in the way that things can be real that have been practiced so long they have become indistinguishable from genuine. It was the totality that made me cold, the absence of any seam, the perfection of it, which is not a quality of things that are simply true. But I was a servant. I stood at the wall, and what I saw or felt or suspected had no bearing on what was about to happen. The rings were produced toward the middle of the morning, 9 of them, each on a cushion of dark cloth, each one unremarkable to look at, and yet producing in every man who saw them a quality of attention that I hadn't seen directed at any object before. Not greed exactly. Something underneath greed. The awareness, immediate and physical, of something that was precisely the shape of a want you hadn't known you had until it appeared before you, and your whole body recognized it. I watched the kings' faces in the moment the rings were shown. I have thought about those faces many times since, and I have concluded that what I saw in them was not corruption, not yet, but the revelation of something that had always been present. The rings did not put anything into those men that was not already there, but they simply showed each man the shape of his own hunger, clearly and completely, perhaps for the first time in his life, and the seeing of it was so total that most of them simply stopped pretending it was not there. The king I will call Vorath, a large man from the eastern territories whose wealth was legendary and whose appetite for more of it was the subject of diplomatic dispatches that I had spent years filing, was the first to step forward. He did not wait to be invited. He was across the room and reaching for his ring before the cushions had fully settled, and having taken it, he stood there turning it in his fingers with an expression on his face that I can only describe as arrival. The look of a man who has spent his whole life moving towards something without knowing what it was and has now found it. Then he looked up at Adonir and said, not with a laugh that filled the room, and that had in it the specific quality of a man who has decided that his desires are so natural and so reasonable that expressing them boldly is simply honesty, that one ring for a man of his stature was insufficient, He had sons. He had generals. He had a kingdom that would need many hands to govern once he had the power to expand it. Surely the Lord of Gifts had more to give. The laughter that followed from some of the other kings was the laughter of men who shared the instinct, but lacked the brazenness to voice it, released now by Vorath's voicing of it into something they could participate in without having made it. One or two of them were already at the cushions. Another was speaking rapidly to Adonir about the disposition of territories he intended to bring under his dominion. But a fourth had placed his ring on his finger, and was standing very still with his eyes closed, and an expression of such private intensity that I looked away from it, the way you look away from something you were not meant to see. Lord Adonir had not moved from his position near the window. I noticed this before I understood its significance. He had simply not moved. While the room reorganized itself around the rings and the wanting and the noise of men who have been given permission to be exactly as acquisitive as they had always been, he stood where he had been standing when the rings were produced, and he watched, and his hands were still at his sides, and his face had the expression I had learned over 22 years to associate with him doing serious thinking in a room where he did not intend to reveal that he was doing it. Vorath noticed first. Or perhaps Vorath noticed and cared most. He was still holding his ring, still turning it, and he looked across the room at the one man who had not moved, and the expression on his face shifted from triumphant to something sharper. "Why does Adonir hesitate?" he said. "Does he not want his kingdom to prosper? Does he not want power enough to protect his people? Or does he perhaps not consider himself worthy of such a gift?" The room heard this. The room always hears things said in that tone. My lord turned from the window. His voice when he spoke was careful in the way that his voice was always careful when he was managing something he felt strongly. He said he was grateful for the invitation and for the evident generosity of their host. He said he had questions he hoped might be answered before he made a decision of this magnitude. "What questions?" said one of the other kings, in a tone that indicated the existence of questions was itself the problem. "What does the giver want in return?" said my lord. "Nothing of value is given without cost." He had not lived as long as he had by accepting the terms of a transaction before understanding what the terms were. He meant no discourtesy to their host. He simply preferred to know what he was agreeing to. The silence that followed had a specific character. Not the silence of men considering a reasonable point, the silence of men who do not want the reasonable point to be heard too clearly, or because the reasonable point has the potential to complicate something they have already decided. Adonir spoke then, with the specific warmth of someone who has anticipated this objection and prepared a response for it that sounds like improvisation. He spoke of fellowship, of the wish to see the kingdoms of men flourish, of the belief that men had been underestimated and underserved by the powers of the world, and that this was a wrong he wished to help correct. He spoke beautifully, of the words fell into the room like light falling into a dark space, and several of the kings who had been watching my lord with impatience relaxed visibly as the words filled the gap his questions had opened. My lord listened to all of it. Then he said, with the politeness of a man delivering a problem rather than an accusation, that this answered the question of what the giver said he wanted, but not the question of what the giver actually wanted, and that in his experience those two things were not always identical. The silence this time was different, colder. Vorath said that perhaps Adonir was afraid. Perhaps his caution, which had always been so celebrated in his own small corner of the world, was simply another word for cowardice. Perhaps a man who spent his life building careful arrangements and asking careful questions was not a king at all in any sense that mattered, but simply an administrator with a crown. and one or two of the others laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Someone else, I do not remember who, said that if Adonir refused the gift, then the gift might be withdrawn. That Anatar's generosity had limits. That one man's hesitation might cost all of them what they had been offered. Did he understand the weight of that? Did he understand what he would be taking from the rest of them if his caution prevailed? I watched my lord's face during this. I want to be precise about what I saw because I have replayed it many times, and I believe I saw it correctly. He heard the accusation of cowardice, and it landed. Not because he believed it, I do not think he believed it, but because he had spent a lifetime being measured against men like Vorath, and found wanting by the measure those men used, and the accusation arrived into a place that had been struck before and was not fully healed. And then he heard the suggestion that his refusal might cost the others, and I watched something happen in his face that I had never seen there before. A kind of collapse, very small and very quick, the look of a man whose argument has been turned from the question of what is right into the question of what his refusal will cost other people, and who does not know how to hold his position against that particular pressure. He was not a coward in the way Vorath meant it. He was not afraid of the ring or of Sauron or of power. He was afraid of the room, of the specific social weight of being the one man standing apart while everyone else had already committed, of the contempt in Vorath's voice and the laughter of the others, and the implication that his caution was selfishness dressed as wisdom. He had spent 22 years building careful things in a world that preferred spectacle, and he had made his peace with being underestimated, and he had found freedom in that peace. But the peace, it turned out, had a limit. And the limit was a room full of kings looking at him the way Vorath was looking at him. I saw him make the decision. I cannot tell you exactly when in the sequence of those few minutes it happened, because the decision was not a single moment, but a series of small surrenders, each one making the next more inevitable. I watched the questions stop forming behind his eyes. I watched the stillness in his hands resolve into movement. I watched him cross the room to the last remaining cushion and stand before it for just a moment. Long enough for me to hope. And then reach down and take the ring and close his fingers around it and straighten up and turn back to the room with an expression on his face that was not triumph and was not satisfaction and was not any of the things the faces around him were showing. It was the expression of a man who has just done something he knew he should not do, and who is already living in the knowledge of it. Vorath cheered and clapped him on the shoulder, with the broad generosity of a man who has won something and can afford to be magnanimous now. The room moved on. Anatar moved through it, attending to each king in turn, and I watched him reach my lord last and speak with him briefly, and I watched my lord listen, and I watched something in Anatar's face in that moment that was visible for perhaps half a second before it was covered again, and something that was not warmth and was not generosity, and that I would spend years trying to name before I found the word for it. Satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of a gift given, the satisfaction of a trap that has closed. I was at the wall. I said nothing. There was nothing I could have said. That night, in the private chambers after the other kings had dispersed to their celebrations, I was alone with my lord for the last time that I can say with honesty that he was fully himself. He sat by the window where he had stood that morning, and he held the ring in his open palm and looked at it for a long time without speaking. I moved through the room doing the small tasks that end a day, and I waited, because I had learned over 22 years that he would speak when he was ready, and that speaking before he was ready produced nothing useful. He said, without looking up from the ring, that I had been watching him today. I said that I was always watching. It was my job to watch. He said that I had seen him hesitate. I said yes. He said nothing for a while. Then he said that he had known, from the moment the rings were produced, that accepting one was a mistake. Not a feeling, not an instinct, but a reasoned conclusion that he had arrived at before Vorath had opened his mouth. He said the reasoning was simple, and he could reproduce it now if I wanted to hear it. The cost of a gift of this magnitude could not be less than the gift itself. What a being of this power who chose to strengthen the kingdoms of men had a purpose in that strengthening that served himself. Whatever the rings gave, they would take back in some form that had not yet been disclosed. He had known this. He had said as much. I said that I had heard him say it. He looked up from the ring then, and looked at me, and what I saw in his face was not the beginning of corruption. Not yet. But what I saw was a man who understood precisely what he had done, and precisely why he had done it, and who had no comfortable story to tell himself about either. He said quietly that he had spent his whole life being the careful one, the measured one, the one who built slowly and held to what he built and did not grasp at things beyond his reach. What he had been mocked for it, and he had not minded being mocked for it, because he believed he was right, and the mocking did not change whether he was right. But today, he said, in that room, with those men looking at him the way they were looking at him, he had found the limit of his not minding. He had found the place where the cost of holding his position had become, for one moment, more than he could pay. And in that moment he had let go of what he knew to be true because the room required him to, and the ring was the consequence of that, and he understood that the consequence was larger than the moment that had produced it, and that he would be paying it for longer than he currently had the ability to imagine. He did not ask for my opinion. He did not ask for reassurance or absolution or the comfort of being told he had done what anyone would have done. He stated what he had done and why, and what he believed it would cost, with the same precise and honest attention he had brought to every problem I had watched him work on for 22 years. Then he closed his hand around the ring, and he did not speak about it again. That conversation has stayed with me across the decades, in a way that I find difficult to explain to people who were not there. It was not a dramatic scene. He did not weep or rage or make speeches about fate and failure, as he simply looked at what he had done in the clear light of his own judgment and described what he saw without flinching and without excusing himself. And then he closed his hand around the thing and went forward into what it made of him. There was a quality to that clarity in those final hours of his wholeness that I haven't seen equaled in any man before or since. He was, at the end of what he was, exactly what he had always been. Not the man who looked at things honestly and named them correctly. The tragedy was simply that he had done it one day too late. The changes came slowly at first. This is what I hadn't expected. I had anticipated something dramatic, something that would mark a before and after with the clarity that the moment in the meeting hall had seemed to demand. What happened instead was a series of very small things across many months that individually signified nothing and collectively signified everything. His sleep changed. He had always been a reliable sleeper, a man who went to bed at a consistent hour and rose at a consistent hour, and who used sleep as a practical tool the way he used everything else. In the months after the meeting, he began waking before dawn, and I would find him at his desk or at the window, not working, simply present in the darkness in a way that had no purpose I could identify. When I asked, he said he was thinking. He had always thought at his desk or at the window. So this was not an answer that explained the difference. What was different was the quality of his presence during these hours. He was not the man thinking at his desk. He was something sitting in the chair where that man usually thought. His questions slowed. This was the change I noticed most, because his questions had always been the most characteristic thing about him. The constant low-level interrogation of everything around him, the asking of things other men considered obvious or beneath them, or already answered. In the year after the meeting, I began to count the questions, without telling myself that I was counting them, and I watched the count decline across the months, with the specific dread of watching a vital sign behave wrongly. By the second year, he asked perhaps a third of what he had asked before. By the third year, less than that. The interests went next. He had always read widely. Histories and natural philosophy, and the kind of mathematical treatises that most men in his position left to their scholars, reading them himself because he believed that understanding how his advisors arrived at their conclusions was more valuable than simply receiving the conclusions. The books were still on his desk through the second and third year, but I began to notice that the same ones sat in the same positions for weeks without being moved, and when I rearranged them to dust them and then rearranged them back, he didn't notice, which he would have noticed before. What he gave his attention to instead was the ring. Not always visibly, not always with the ring in his hand or even in sight, but there was a quality of his attention through those years that had the character of a man listening to something, a frequency beneath the audible range of the room he was in, that drew the largest portion of what he had available towards something I could not see or hear. He was still present in the room. He conducted his affairs with reasonable competence. He received petitions and issued judgments and attended to the correspondence. But there was a part of him that was simply elsewhere, in the way that a man is elsewhere when he is in love, except that what he was elsewhere toward had nothing of love in it. Nor the court noticed but said nothing, because saying nothing was the court's habitual response to the behavior of the man who signed their commissions. I noticed because I was there every day, and because I had 22 years of his wholeness to measure the changes against. The difference between what he had been and what he was becoming was not visible in any single moment. It was only visible if you had been present for enough of the moments to watch the direction they were moving. Though in the fourth year there was a morning that I have returned to more often than any other. He had been going over tax assessments from the northern provinces, a task he had always done himself rather than delegating, because he believed that the numbers from the north were where his administration was most vulnerable to misrepresentation, and that only his own eyes on them provided adequate protection against it. I brought the documents at the usual time and set them at his desk, and he looked at them for a moment and then looked at me and said, with a puzzlement that was entirely genuine, that he was not certain why these required his personal attention. I stood very still. I said that he had always reviewed the northern assessments personally, that he had explained his reasoning for this to me on several occasions, that the policy was of his own creation. He looked at the documents again. Then he said that presumably his advisors were capable of handling this, that he had more important matters to attend to. I asked what matters. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before, and have not seen on any human face since, something that was almost impatience, but was more than impatience, the specific irritation of a mind that is being required to account for itself to something it no longer considers significant. Then the expression was gone, and he was simply my lord again, slightly tired perhaps, slightly distracted, perfectly courteous. He said he appreciated my diligence. He said I should leave the documents, and he would attend to them presently. He did not attend to them. I checked 3 days later, and they had not been moved. I do not know exactly when he stopped being the man I had served. I do not think there was a single moment that could be identified as the last one. What there was, instead, was a gradual thinning, the way light thins toward evening, where you cannot say, "Here is the moment the day ended," because the ending happened in fractions too small to isolate. By the 5th year, the man who had stood at the window and asked questions that nobody wanted asked was present in the same way that a reflection is present, there if you looked directly at it, but without depth or substance, without the quality of something that would push back if you pushed. But the last time he looked at me was in the 6th year. I do not mean the last time his eyes found me in a room. I mean the last time I felt, receiving his gaze, that there was someone behind it looking back. We were in the corridor outside the great hall, and he was moving through toward some appointment I no longer remember, and I was beside him, as I had always been. And he stopped for a moment, for no reason that I could identify, and he looked at me, and something happened in his face that I can only describe as a surfacing, the way a man surfaces from deep water, briefly, before going under again. What I saw in his face in that moment was recognition, not of my name or my position, but of something older than that. The recognition of a connection that had existed across 22 years, and that was still present in some residual form underneath everything that had accumulated on top of it. He opened his mouth, but he did not speak. Whatever had surfaced found no words available to it, or found words and understood they were insufficient, or simply ran out of time before it could be used. Then the moment passed, and he moved on down the corridor, and I stood there and understood that what I had just seen was the last of him, the last piece of the man who had stood at the window on that last night and described what he had done in the clear light of his own judgment. After that, there was only what came next, which I will not describe in detail because the detail is not mine to give, and because I have heard enough accounts of what the ring wraiths are to know, that my description of this particular one's becoming would add nothing to the understanding of their nature. What I will say is that the end of the process, watched from the position I occupied across those years, was not frightening in the way that the legends suggest. It was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It was the last increment of a long subtraction, and what was left when the subtraction was complete was not a monster that had replaced a man, but simply the absence of the man, with the shape of him still there. I left his service in the 7th year, when there was no longer any service to give that had any meaningful connection to the person I had agreed to serve. I have been asked since why I did not leave sooner, and I have never found a satisfying answer. The honest answer is probably that leaving felt like a final confirmation of something I was not yet ready to confirm, and that staying, even when staying meant attending to a hollowed thing in a familiar chair, was a form of refusal to accept what the hollowing meant. Men do foolish things to avoid accepting what they already know to be true. I am not exempt from that. I have thought about that meeting hall across the 40 years since I left his service, and I have thought about the room, and the kings and the rings on the cushions, and the particular quality of Vorath's laugh, and the way the others settled into their wanting with such evident relief, as though the wanting had been the truth of them all along, and the rings had simply given them permission to stop concealing it. I have thought about Anatar moving through the room with that perfect warmth that was not warmth, and about the half-second of satisfaction on his face when he reached my lord last. And I have thought about my lord at the window, about the questions he asked that the room didn't want asked, which were the right questions, which were the questions that a man of his quality of attention would always have asked, and which, if they had been answered honestly, or even pursued seriously, might have changed what followed. Not for Vorath, perhaps. Not for the ones already across the room and reaching before the cushions had settled. But for him. For the one who hesitated. For the one who knew. I have thought about what it would have required for him to hold his position in that room. Not much, is the answer I keep arriving at. And it is the answer that has made the 40 years hardest. It would not have required courage of any extraordinary kind. It would not have required him to be a different man than he was, or more powerful, or more wise, or more resistant to darkness than human nature allows. It would have required only that he trust, for 5 more minutes, in a room full of people who did not want him to, what he already knew, what he had already said, what he had known since before Vorath opened his mouth. He was not brought low by supernatural power. He was not seduced by darkness, or deceived by magnificent promises, or corrupted by ambitions he could not control. He was brought low by a room, by the specific social weight of standing apart when everyone else has already committed, by the voice of a contemptible man asking, in a contemptible tone, whether he considered himself too good for what was being offered. That is the thing I cannot make peace with, even now. That what was lost, what was surrendered into an eternity of service to a dark will, was not lost to any force that should have been able to defeat him. He was defeated by the oldest and most ordinary of human failures, and by caring too much what a room full of lesser men thought of him. He was called a coward for hesitating. He became one for stopping. I am old now, and there is not much of my life left to measure what I know against. But I know this. In all the years I served him, and in all the years since, I have never met another man who would have hesitated at all, who would have stood at the window and asked the questions, and weathered the contempt and felt, as he felt, or the full weight of the wrong thing closing around him, even as he reached for it. The others did not hesitate because the others did not see. He hesitated because he saw clearly, and then looked away. And I have come to believe, in the years since, that the seeing was not a small thing, that a man who could see that clearly, who could stand in a room built to blind people and see through it anyway, was not a common man, was not the boring, careful administrator that Vorath's contempt had made him out to be, was something rarer than that, something that the world of men couldn't afford to lose. But the world of men lost him anyway, to a room, to a laugh, to the unbearable weight of standing alone for 5 more minutes in a world that did not yet understand what those 5 minutes were worth. I have never forgotten his face at the window that last night, the clarity of it, the honesty, or the look of a man who knows exactly what he has done and does not flinch from the knowing. I think of it still. I think of it as the last true thing I saw in him. And I think that somewhere, in whatever remains of what he was, in whatever passes for memory, in the thing that wears his shadow now, that clarity is still there, buried under everything the ring has built on top of it, still present, still his, still knowing.